Welcome, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I will give you a moment to connect to audio in case you're not already connected. Welcome, welcome. All right. Why don't we get started? So hi, and welcome to this first Friday lecture for the month of June 2025. Our speaker today is the Claudia Trout Distinguished Instructor in the Basic Program of Liberal Education for Adults, Amy Thomas Elder. The title of Amy's lecture is Radical Evil from Kant to Nuclearism. This First Friday lecture is supported by the Anastopoulos Lecture Series Fund in memory of Basic Program instructor George Anastopoulos. My name is Noah Chaffetz, and I'm the Cyril O'Hoole Chair of the Basic Program. Please note that this presentation is being recorded so that we can make it available on the Graham School YouTube channel. During this lecture, and during the question and answer period that follows it, you will not be able to unmute your microphones, but we invite you to enter questions for Amy in the chat box at any time during the event. Amy will have a chance to respond to your questions after her lecture. During the lecture, Amy and I will be able to see only a handful of your video feeds, so you may choose to leave your video on or turn it off. Amy's video will be spotlighted during the lecture, so the best way to view it is to select speaker view instead of gallery view. Before I give Amy a full introduction, let me tell you a little bit about the Basic Program and the Graham School of Continuing Liberal and Professional Studies at the University of Chicago. So along with the Basic Program, the Graham School offers an array of programming across the liberal arts, including our Masters of Liberal Arts program and our open enrollment courses, as well as a number of events and travel study opportunities. Since 1946, the Basic Program has provided our students a rigorous liberal arts curriculum dedicated to direct engagement with original texts. At the heart of the Basic Program is our 4-year core sequence, which offers firsthand encounters with some of the greatest works of the classical and Western traditions in a community of adult learners and in courses taught by experienced instructors who are all trained in the Socratic method of leading discussion. Registration for the summer and fall quarters is ongoing, and our sections have a tendency to fill up quickly, as nearly all of you know, so I recommend that if you haven't done so already, you reserve your spots in our courses as soon as you can. Our next First Friday lecture will take place on September 12th. Our speaker will be Basic Program instructor Simon Friedland, and the title of Simon's lecture will be A Christian Mystic Reads Homer, Simone Weil on the Iliad. Today's speaker, Amy Thomas Elder, holds a BS in biology and advanced degrees in classics and the study of religion. Her research at the Divinity School of the University of Chicago dealt with allegory and textual interpretation in early Christianity. She has taught in a number of different contexts, including a museum, a Girl Scouts camp, middle school, high school, college, and seminary. For many years, Amy taught in and directed the Odyssey Project, a college-level humanities program for adults living on low incomes as part of the Bard College Clemente course. She has been a Basic Program instructor since 1999. Now, let me hand things over to Amy. All right, Amy, whenever you're ready.
Hello, happy D-Day. I am especially honored to be giving this lecture. I need to share my screen. This lecture supported by the George Anastopoulos Lecture Fund on D-Day. I don't know where George was on June 6th, but he served in the Air Force during the war, and he was a great man of the greatest generation, and one I feel lucky to have known and privileged and deeply humbled to follow after as I am able. And I want to thank you for being here to help me in thinking through a problem that has come to occupy me and that Elder and Lynn and I have been wrestling with for a while now, the problem of radical evil, as I recently encountered it in Jonathan Schell's 1982 book, The Fate of the Earth, which we read last spring as a part of a class entitled The Crisis of Modernity, Apocalypse. We read several other very scary books at that time, including one that came out during the class called Nuclear War, a Scenario by Annie Jacobson, which, quote, sketches out a global nuclear war with by-the-minute precision for all of the 72 minutes between the first missile launch and the end of the world. Her scenario is indeed terrifying, however accustomed we may be to thinking about the facts of existential threats. But terror aside, it was Schell that gripped me with his analysis of our situation with respect to nuclear weapons, that is, that we have them and that we have plans to use them, as one of radical evil, drawing on Hannah Arendt's very powerful use of that term in The Origins of Totalitarianism to describe the Nazi policy of extermination. But paradoxical as it may seem, I found reading Schell bracing and even inspiriting, and it brought me a strange kind of hope. And this is what I want to see if I can communicate some of to you today. This will not be an argument for disarmament or any other nuclear policy, which I would not begin to presume to know what to do about. By nuclearism in the title, I mean just what Webster's offers, dependence on or faith in nuclear weapons as the means for maintaining national security. This is the situation then that Schell describes as radical evil. What I find so powerful in the account has at least as much to do with the concept of radical evil as it does with the effects of nuclear weapons. Like many people, I don't particularly like thinking about nuclear weapons and their possible use, but doing so with Schell clarified for me something about the obscure and elusive nature of evil, and allowed me a way of seeing how that concept is essential to, or as we say around here, internal to the meaning of our humanity, and therefore essential to comprehending our human and historical situation and our own place in it. When I say that evil is internal to the meaning of our humanity, I do not mean that we all have temptations to evil or that we have evil tendencies. We knew that. I mean something about what our humanity means. And in order to explain that, I need to talk first about the concept of evil and then about the concept of radical evil, a term that Arendt picked up from Kant and turned inside out. Following the work of my partner, Charles Thomas Elder, following Wittgenstein, I want to try to set forth a grammar of evil and of the grammatical innovation radical evil. By a grammar, I do not mean a semantic argument about words, for words have uses and they have reference, things to which they refer, which are real things. But this is not a theological or philosophical argument either about the nature of evil, nor of theodicy, the question of why there's evil. That's Dostoevsky's problem, or Ivan's, as Claire so ably described for us in this forum last month. It is rather an attempt to consider the reality of our unprecedented situation using a concept drawn from myth in order to better understand its reality. Evil is a special kind of word. So I want to propose first to investigate its meaning, its use, and its concept. Wittgenstein famously said, "For a large class of cases, though not for all, in which we employ the word meaning, it can be defined thus: the meaning of a word is its use in the language." That large class includes common terms, cup, lucky, forget, and maybe some uncommon ones, but truly foundational terms like goodness, beauty, justice, in addition to referring to certain conventions, also have meanings that exceed particular and conventional uses and refer to something ambiguous, elusive, ultimately incomprehensible, but objective, as Socrates began to teach us. The standard of justice by which we judge something just or unjust, if it is more than a matter of mere convention, is something that we only come to know by way of a practice of reflection, study, discussion, attention, as Simone Weil and Iris Murdoch put it. Something that, as Murdoch says, we grow in understanding of to the extent that we work at it. Evil is a less attractive term than truth, beauty, and justice. But it too is one that we might grow in by understanding and cultivating a certain kind of vision, a way of seeing, by exposing ourselves to things that we would rather not see and rather not think about, and actively imagine possibilities that seem both to defy imagination and comprehension. The suffering of the death camps, for example, or the effects of a nuclear holocaust, but also by way of literary and artistic expressions that evoke the truths of these things in ways that the facts perhaps cannot, since the facts seem to crush the very possibility of comprehension. Grammar is another practice that we might employ. It is, in the Wittgensteinian sense, a description of language, but one that gets light, that is to say, its purpose from philosophical problems. Grammar describes language in such a way as to reveal the deep grammatical conditions of sense. Grammar displays these conditions. Grammar comes, as it were, before facts. It is an investigation of the conditions of making meaningful statements, and hence an investigation into the conditions of facts as such. It might be worth thinking about what conditions must exist in order for us to be able to use the word evil and have it refer to something in the world. To the extent that it aims at a change in our way of seeing, as opposed to conveying information of some sort or demonstrating the truth of a thesis, grammar is essentially a form of persuasion. It is rhetorical rather than demonstrative. Grammar says, in effect, look at things like this, not like that. What is it that prompts us to use the word evil instead of bad or criminal or even heinous? It's a word you don't expect to find in an article in the New York Times, no matter how much they hate something. It does not belong to ordinary factual description, but to theology, to myth, to a depth dimension that requires different standards from the journalistic. And of course, it's a dangerous word, one that is frequently misused in public discourse, because to call someone or something evil is to set them in a world of myth, of primal and mysterious and metaphysical forces. To call something evil is to invoke a dimension of depth that bad, criminal, and heinous lack, and thus opens the way to a philosophical practice of attention to and reflection on realities to which we do not ordinarily refer. These realities are ambiguous, elusive, and ultimately incomprehensible, but they're real, they're objective, and though they are beyond the reference of our everyday words and broadly shared forms of social communication, they have sense. Oops. What is bad should be ameliorated or otherwise managed. What is criminal should be punished or forgiven. We may be forced to choose among bads to compensate for them. Evil does not allow such a choice. It cannot be ameliorated or managed, only checked or defeated, and there is no compensation for it. When people say the lesser of two evils, they really mean the lesser of two bads. A choice between one evil and another evil is no choice at all. In myth and in theology, evil is simply what must be renounced and resisted, which is a narrative and not a categorical definition. That is, we recognize evil by what it demands of human beings, rather than by some telltale sign like a shark's dorsal fin. In certain baptismal liturgies, the celebrant asks the candidate, "Do you renounce the evil powers of this world which corrupt and destroy the creatures of God?" The candidate answers, "I renounce them," without knowing specifically what that even means. Part of the grammar of evil is that it is something you must fight, or at least resist. What you can't in any way resist, it seems to me, must be nature and not evil. Even if there's no external resistance possible, there has to be an internal one. And that internal resistance may be no more and no less than to think. And we'll come back to this eventually. Again, what I mean here by grammar and by thinking is not coming up with a definition and far less an explanation of evil, but to consider what must be the case for us to use the word in a way that makes sense of our history and our experience and brings some coherence to the way we think about them. You could say again that Socrates practiced grammar. He asked for definitions of foundational terms, but only in order to show them inadequate, and to be able to attend to the tacit knowledge that lies beyond any definition. It belongs to the grammar of evil, for instance, that it is incommensurable. There's nothing like it. Evil is opposed to and capable of destroying the good, the possibility of good, the conditions of good. It also destroys human beings, but so do many other things which are not necessarily evil. Oops, sorry. It does not, like murder, refer to a specific act. In that sense, it is in some sense metaphysical, naming a grammatical order, not a bounded object. It's inimical to human beings, something that excludes good, and therefore it is something mysterious, since a will to evil is a grammatical contradiction, since the will desires what it calls good. Like all our concepts, evil has a history and even a prehistory that lives in it. It is this web of connotations that gives our language its depth and its possibilities for describing our lives and situations in ways that go beyond the surface meaning and interpretation of things, that make the depth and meaning of our human situation real and weighty. If you have to resist or oppose something, what you oppose is something objective and real and powerful. That the specter of nuclear weapons and the prospect of annihilation embodied in them assumes a new kind of objectivity once it's characterized as radical evil is something that I hope I'll be able to show. It may be that we can't fully comprehend or conceptualize the threat that our nuclear situation represents, but we experience it differently, and it resonates on a new level with a new and in some ways unexpected depth. But this takes more than just applying the term. Again, I'm not seeking a timeless notion of evil. I will maintain and try to show that evil has taken on a new meaning and significance in the 20th century, as Arendt and Schell bring to our attention through their coinage of radical evil. And for this, I will follow Schell in appropriating Kant's term radical evil, but with a very different meaning and reference from Kant. Just a quick tour of the history of the term evil before the 20th century. Someone else might want to speak about the notion of evil in Buddhism and other traditions and how all of this might be relevant here. I hope that someone will. I cannot. There's also an old meaning of evil as woe or any cause of suffering apart from any moral reference, disease, death, natural disaster. Since the word evil can refer either to suffering or sin in the Western tradition, philosophy and theology in their various ways explore that sense of evil as suffering and evil as sin as being somehow related to one another. But that's not our problem either. It's been argued, and I think quite persuasively, that the concept of evil as a force opposed to God and the good is foreign to the religion of ancient Israel and to the Hebrew Bible. In the New Testament, it makes a sudden and powerful appearance because Christianity comes to the scene as a historical, apocalyptic, and dualistic religion. And most of our images and stories of evil derive from the period of early Christianity, Satan and hell and the four horsemen of the apocalypse. If you wanted to generalize dangerously, you might say that with the retreat from apocalypticism, that is, when it looked like Jesus was not coming back next Thursday, Catholic Christianity achieved a new Platonizing monism. That is, whatever evil power is granted to Satan, he holds only temporarily and by God's allowance. Evil has no separate essence and comes about only as a result of the freedom of good things to fall from their goodness. This, of course, is very much Augustine's notion, as he brings forth so powerfully in the Confessions and his story about throwing the pears to the pigs because he had the lower desire for mischief rather than the higher desire for the glory of God. Aquinas gives this a very, of course, a very philosophical formulation, and I want to share that with you. because the first principle of good is the highest and perfect good, which pre-contains in itself all goodness, as shown above. But there cannot be a supreme evil, because, as was shown above, although evil always lessens good, yet it never wholly consumes it. And thus, while good ever remains, nothing can be wholly and perfectly bad. Therefore, the philosopher, Aristotle, says that if the wholly evil could be, it would destroy itself, because all good being destroyed, which it need be for something to be wholly evil, evil itself would be taken away, since its subject is good. For Augustine and Aquinas, evil cannot be radical. The root, that's the etymological meaning of radical. The root is good. Evil comes about because good things fail to become as good as God intends them to be. Evil is a lack, a deficiency. And then comes the Reformation, with its attention to the individual soul and its own naked relation to God. Luther refers to doubt of God's word as, quote, radical sin, which is inherited from Adam and Eve, but for which each individual is individually responsible. Kant, of course, inherited Luther, and in his late and highly controversial work, Religion Within the Limits of Reason Alone, he transforms Luther's radical sin into his new coinage, radical evil. Kant was concerned not with the problem of evil as theodicy, that is, how is it possible that a good God allows evil in the world, but as it bears on human freedom of will and action. Like Luther, he grounds evil in human freedom, but he eschews any notion of original sin. He limits his consideration to individual human actions and wills. I think it's possible that Kant chose the word radical, beginning from the idea that evil is to be eradicated from the soul, and from there arrives at the idea of evil as having a root, its own root. That is, Kant is trying to reject the notion of evil articulated by Plato and Augustine, in that evil has, for him, he says, its own root. On the other hand, he doesn't want the source of evil to come from nature. So he says, now, if a propensity to the inversion of the ethical order of the imperatives does lie in human nature, if it does, there is in man a natural propensity to evil. And since this very propensity must in the end be sought in a will which is free and can therefore be imputed, it is morally evil. This evil is radical because it corrupts the ground of all maxims. At the same time, Kant insists again and again that natural inclinations are not in themselves evil, and that evil therefore has to have a source not in nature, but in the soul of man. The argument becomes complex and to many critics contradictory. Bernstein, in his book, Radical Evil, says that in his notion of radical evil, Kant's at war with himself. And Kant himself says that for this reason, radical evil is inscrutable. We have no comprehensible reason for knowing whence moral evil could first of all have come to us. I confess that I personally lost patience in trying to work it all out. Arendt says, as we shall see, that Kant could not have conceived radical evil in the sense in which she wants to talk about it. Some interesting things happened to the notion of evil in the Romantic period, beginning perhaps with the statement by Blake that Milton in Paradise Lost was really on Satan's side because he gave the devil all the best lines. And we could talk more about the romantic hero as this great rebel against the divine order. Nietzsche, of course, evil becomes no more than a function of human judgment. And he sets himself the task of reclaiming the will from Kant, making it the source of life and direction. to raise the will above good and evil and to apotheosize the will to power. In The Heart of Darkness, just because I'm reading Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian right now, like usually, this figure loses some of his tragic grandeur as he passes from Milton's Satan to maybe Melville's Ahab to Conrad's Kurtz. But that's kind of a sidetrack from our course. So, the origins of totalitarianism. Before Hannah Arendt's famous or notorious coining of the term banality of evil for Adolf Eichmann and other officials who orchestrated the Nazi concentration and death camps, she had already, in the origins of totalitarianism, taken over Kant's term radical evil and given it a meaning quite entirely different from his. We don't have time here to go into Arendt's subtle, original, and brilliant analysis of totalitarianism and the concentration camps, and no brief summary will do it justice, because through the pains she takes in describing how the unthinkable became the actual, she challenges and even explodes our inherited conceptions of history, humanity, morality, rights, politics, and nations, among other things. What is radical for Arendt is not an origin of evil in the human will or anywhere else, but rather the root of humanity, which it attacks and destroys. That root, the source and nourishment of our collective humanity, is human freedom, spontaneity, plurality, individuality, that which transforms, transfigures, and brings into the world something new. So while for Kant, evil is radical because it's rooted, for Arendt, it is radical because it is root destroying. And in fact, she says that Kant could not have conceived radical evil any more than Plato could. It is inherent, she writes, in our entire philosophical tradition that we cannot conceive a radical evil. And this is true both for Christian theology, which conceded even to the devil himself a celestial origin, as well as for Kant, the only philosopher who, in the word radical böse, he coined for it, at least must have suspected the existence of this evil, even though he immediately rationalized it in the concept of a, quote, perverted ill will that could be explained by comprehensible motives. Therefore, we actually have nothing to fall back on in order to understand a phenomenon that nevertheless confronts us with its overpowering reality and breaks down all standards we know. What we have in the 20th century, Arendt says, is a new experience. There has always been suffering, crime, evil, but something new has now appeared. Not, of course, from scratch, and the whole of the origins of totalitarianism is an attempt to discover the social, economic, scientific, and historical conditions that led to the eruption of radical evil, to which the concentration camps bore witness. In the camps, she writes, appears some radical evil, previously unknown to us, that puts an end to the notion of developments and transformations of qualities. That is the process of life, development and transformation. Here, there are neither political, nor historical, nor simply moral standards, but at the most, the realization that something seems to be involved in modern politics that actually should never be involved in politics as we used to understand it, namely, all or nothing. All, and that is an undetermined infinity of forms of human living together, or nothing, for a victory of the concentration camp system would mean the same inexorable doom for human beings as the use of the hydrogen bomb would mean the doom of the human race. This is a typically Arendtian way of putting the death of humanity. For her, it would be the end of possibility, of compromise, of discourse, of human beings cooperating and competing and even fighting with one another. Threatening, bullying, and manipulating, Arendt says, are not yet radically evil because they still recognize the humanity of the other, even if they want to dominate it. Radical evil is turned against the plurality and diversity that is its very root, humanity's very root, and against the possibility of judgment itself, since it destroys all the standards we know. As an example of this, we can see in Arendt's discussion of crime and punishment. She writes, when the impossible was made possible, it became the unpunishable, unforgivable absolute evil, which could no longer be understood or explained by the evil motives of self-interest, greed, covetousness, resentment, lust for power, and cowardice, and which therefore anger could not revenge, love could not endure, friendship could not forgive. Just as the victims in the death factories or the holes of oblivion are no longer human in the eyes of the executioners, so this newest species of criminals is beyond the pale even of solidarity in human sinfulness. That is, genocide as a crime against humanity is a new sort of crime. It is something that no one can punish or forgive. Not for the reasons that Ivan refuses to forgive the nobleman whose dogs tear the child to pieces before the mother's eyes. Ivan's argument that not even God has that right. But because, says Arendt, there is nothing commensurate with it. No way to pay, no way to redeem, no way to make right, no way to forgive. And this radical evil is something that cannot be understood in the way that evil has been understood in the past as some sort of failure of goodness, something that will ultimately be overcome by a good that is enduring. Bear with us. What runs counter to common sense is not the nihilistic principle that everything is permitted, which was already contained in the 19th century utilitarian conception of common sense. What common sense and normal people refuse to believe is that everything is possible. We attempt to understand elements in present and recollected experience that simply surpass our powers of understanding. We attempt to classify as criminal a thing which, as we all feel, no such category was ever intended to cover. What meaning has the concept of murder when we're confronted with the mass production of corpses? We attempt to understand the behavior of concentration camp inmates and SS men psychologically, when the very thing that must be realized is that the psyche can be destroyed even without the destruction of the physical man. That indeed, psyche, character, and individuality seem under certain circumstances to express themselves only through the rapidity or slowness with which they disintegrate. The end result, in any case, is inanimate men whose return to the psychologically or otherwise intelligibly human world closely resembles the resurrection of Lazarus. It is hard to believe. Arendt writes that even the survivors of the camps had trouble believing their own accounts. And if the speaker has resolutely returned to the world of the living, he himself, she says, is often assailed by doubts with regards to his own truthfulness, as though he had mistaken nightmare for reality. That all of our moral feeling and all of our moral reasoning might be overwhelmed and brought to naught, and that the very meaning of our humanity might be destroyed, is very hard for us to think. Maybe impossible, for how can we think or feel the absence of that by which we think and feel? We still believe in something like human nature, which is good and indestructible. Maybe we Americans in particular, despite everything. I think of how Primo Levi's astonishing account of his time at Auschwitz, which he had titled, "If This Is a Man," was retitled for publication in the United States as "Survival in Auschwitz." I believe that Levy really did mean to ask whether an inmate of Auschwitz was a human being, a question that we can't bear to ask. Arendt says that totalitarian regimes aim to change human nature, but only succeeded in destroying it. If we think of our humanity as something won for us, inherited by us, dependent upon a cultural heritage and not just a genetic one, it is not something simply given and not something that can withstand any conditions. Cormac McCarthy's cannibals in The Road are one imaginative projection of Homo sapiens who have lost humanity, though of course the man and his son retain theirs. To see our humanity as something truly capable of being destroyed without our bodies being destroyed is perhaps the source of a particular terror, and a terror we haven't taken seriously since we stopped believing in damnation and hell, and probably worse than that. This possibility, the death of humanity, even apart from the death of the species, belongs to radical evil. And if it is a possibility, it is a new one, brought about by what has happened in history. One last point about Arendt. For her, radical evil and banal evil, evil that is done by people who won't or can't think what they do, are not different. Banal evil can perfectly well be radical, and it is carried out by perfectly ordinary people, not great Satans of the will to power. And this too is barely thinkable. Arendt has introduced a grammatical innovation taken from Kant, but entirely repurposed to try to refer to and to understand a situation that would otherwise defy understanding. Common sense cannot grasp the kind of evil she described, and the, quote, wheedling liberal voice that she says we all have will only distort it by trying to render it explicable on existing terms. It is important that this is not just a matter of making up a new name for contemporary evil, but of trying to confirm the value of that grammatical innovation by showing how it illuminates very aspects of the realities we face. And those realities in turn give weight to the notion of radical evil. This is, of course, circular, but in a way that reconfigures the world and strengthens our capacity to see, make sense of, and respond to it, to, in Simone Weil's words, read it. Which brings us to Jonathan Schell, an American writer and reporter on American foreign policy, beginning with his documentation of the destruction of villages he witnessed firsthand during the war in Vietnam. He seems eventually to have died of a cancer probably brought on by exposure to Agent Orange. In The Fate of the Earth, originally published in 1982, he brought together several essays written for The New Yorker, and Schell wrote a new introduction for its post-Cold War edition in 2000. Schell cites Arendt's use of radical evil and echoes her point that radical evil transcends the reality of human affairs and potentialities of human power. That's not the slide I wanted. I would like to suggest, he says, that evil becomes radical whenever it goes beyond destroying individual victims in whatever numbers, and in addition mutilates or destroys the world that can in some way respond to and thus in some measure redeem the deaths suffered. This capacity of evil was demonstrated on a large scale in modern times by the totalitarian regimes, which in a manner of speaking attempted to tear gaping, unmendable holes in the fabric of the world, holes into which entire peoples or classes would sink without a trace. But now it has fully emerged in the capacity of the species for self-extinction, which, by ending the world altogether, would dispossess us of all power forever. When crimes are of a certain magnitude and character, they nullify our power to respond to them adequately because they smash the human context in which human losses normally acquire their meaning for us. Like the death camps, then, the nuclear situation confronts us with something that we don't know how to think and that defies all common sense. Schell writes, the possibility that the living can stop the future generations from entering into life compels us to ask basic new questions about our existence, the most sweeping of which is what these unborn ones, most of whom we will never meet, even if they are born, mean to us. Economics professor Robert Heilbronner asked in a 1975 New York Times Magazine article, "What has posterity ever done for me?" His answer, more or less, only given transcendent meaning to my life. Anyway, no one has ever thought to ask this question before our time because no generation before ours has ever held the life and death of the species in its hands. What crime is it to cancel the numberless multitude of unconceived people? In what court is such a crime to be judged? Against whom is it committed? And what law does it violate? Schell describes in some mechanical, though not technical detail, how atomic and thermonuclear bombs work, the discrepancy between the energy latent in matter and all human experience and reckoning. The Hiroshima bomb, though the housing weighed 4 tons, required less than a gram of uranium-238. And even if we've come to accept such things now, this is the stuff of fairy tales, magic dust, a few grains of which can incinerate a city and vaporize its inhabitants. Schell consistently and disturbingly uses the simple future tense to describe what will happen in a nuclear attack, not would or dropping facts that you may know, but I didn't, like that as the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs would fall among what we refer to these days as tactical nuclear weapons, terrifying facts and widely available. Schell titles his first essay quite brilliantly, A Republic of Insects and Grass. At the end of it, he imagines a post-nuclear Earth in which some life is still possible, though it's just as easy to imagine that none would be. Of all the forms of life we know, insects and grasses are most able to withstand ongoing high levels of radiation. And if they inherited the Earth, they would surely speciate fantastically, which is, I suppose, what would make it a republic and not a monarchy. This particular image just touched me, I think, maybe because of my biological background, but there it is. In the 2000 introduction, Schell elaborates radical evil, drawing heavily on Arendt, as in the difference between the evil of murder and the radical evil of extermination. Whatever evil or radical evil might mean for individuals, what it means for states, or even for corporations, is not the sum of all of the evil of the individuals involved. If that were the case, we might be able to understand it again in a more ordinary way, by way of empathy or identification, by a human logic, to which again, radical evil is simply foreign. It is rather systemic. Schell writes, extermination, a species of crime requiring extensive social resources, can only be a systematic evil, as of course was that of the Third Reich. Radical evil operates by a logic that is foreign to even our worst inclinations and tendencies. It operates against our self-interest, individual and collective. It may employ our basic instincts, our baser instincts, but it is not reducible to them. It has its own life and its own logic. It is the sorcerer's apprentice. This is important because it recognizes that radical evil is not to be understood as we ordinarily understand things, as evil things. It takes an effort of the intellect and imagination to grasp it, and what it grasps must always remain, in some degree, a mystery. And here I can't resist a little passage from Blood Meridian. The old man swung his head back and forth. The way of the transgressor is hard. God made this world, but he didn't make it to suit everybody, did he? I don't believe he had me much in mind. Aye, said the old man, but where does a man come by his notions? What world's he seen that he liked better? I can think of better places and better ways. Can you make it be? No. No, it's a mystery. A man's at odds to know his mind because his mind is aught he has to know it with. He can know his heart, but he don't want to. Rightly so. Best not to look in there. It ain't the heart of a creature that is bound in the way that God has set for it. You can find meanness in the least of creatures, but when God made man, the devil was at his elbow. A creature that can do anything, make a machine, and a machine to make a machine, an evil that can run itself 1,000 years, no need to tend it. You believe that? I don't know. Believe it. Is man responsible for the machine made by the machine he made and the evil that the second generation machine does? Yes, of course. No, how could he be? This seems to me to illustrate our position with respect to nuclear weapons. Dick Garwin, designer of the first H-bomb, the only genius Enrico Fermi ever met, died a couple weeks ago. He was, by all accounts, a thorough mensch, generous, politically engaged, helping the woman who ordered snacks for the bulletin of concerned scientists to pick the right bagel combinations. Is he responsible? Am I? In weighing the fate of the Earth, we stand before a mystery, writes Schell. Nuclear weapons threaten not just our lives, but the meaning of our lives. It's not just us, our lives and our children's, nor even the lives of all the individuals who might yet be born. It is the memory of all that ever was, all that our ancestors suffered, all that they or we or any human being might hope. Schell, who is, I think, a great humanist, quotes a proverb attributed to Solon, "Call no man happy until he is dead." This means not only that even the most contented life could be undone by misfortune at the last minute, but also that the meaning of an entire life might depend on its ending. For a life's last chapter was not merely an event with its freight of suffering or joy, it was a disclosure in whose light the story's beginning and middle might need to be drastically rewritten. The nuclear age, says Schell, will end in one of two ways. And until it does end, we don't know what it will have meant. I find something deeply moving about the future perfect tense. What does it mean when you say, "I love you"? Most of the time, you're not quite sure. If you're lucky, one day you'll know what it will have meant. If the nuclear age ends with the end of the species, it will have disclosed much more than the meaning of the 20th century. What will our humanity have meant on its last day? Our dependence upon nuclear weapons, the fact that they exist and that plans to use them exist, is a radical evil because it's beyond our reckoning, beyond our ordinary ways of weighing costs and risks and benefits, beyond calculation and beyond comprehension. It is inconceivable that we possess something so entirely opposed to our own interests. If we can't quite imagine human obliteration, even less can we conceive that we ourselves will bring it about, that we are responsible, not just for making the bombs, which was understandable and probably necessary, but now for keeping them. How do we make sense of this inherited situation, this sin which is ours, but we didn't commit? Both Arendt and Schell say that radical evil is thought-defying. And maybe it's even necessary to keep nuclear weapons. But if it's necessary, there could be no more powerful illumination of Plato's image of the great beast. Imagine that the keeper of a huge, strong beast notices what makes it angry, what it desires, how it has to be approached and handled, the circumstances and the conditions under which it becomes particularly fierce or calm, what provokes its typical cries, and what tones of voice make it gentle or wild. Once he's spent enough time in a creature's company to acquire all this information, he calls it knowledge, forms it into a systematic branch of expertise, and starts to teach it despite total ignorance, in fact, about which of the creature's attitudes and desires is commendable or deplorable, good or bad, moral or immoral. One of the things that shocked me in Schell, and probably shouldn't have, is how game theory enters into nuclear strategy. His usage of all these terms simply conforms to the great beast's attitudes, and he describes things as good or bad according to its likes and dislikes, and can't justify his usage of the terms any further, but describes as right and good the things which are merely indispensable, since he hasn't realized and can't explain to anyone else how vast a gulf there is between necessity and goodness. It would suggest to me that nature itself, if what we're following out is just necessity, is malign, and the Gnostics were right after all. This would be the inverse of the situation that Aquinas describes, the situation that Aquinas says cannot occur. He says there cannot be a supreme evil because evil always lessens the good, yet never wholly consumes it, and thus, while good ever remains, nothing can be wholly and perfectly bad. If the wholly evil could be, it would destroy itself, because all good being destroyed, which it need for something to be wholly evil, evil itself would be taken away. Yes, exactly. Beyond good and evil, indeed. This is Simone Weil from her lectures on philosophy on the Republic. Plato's morality is, do not make the worst possible mistake of deceiving yourself. We know that we are acting correctly when the power of thinking is not hindered by what we are doing. To do only those things which one can think clearly and not do those things which force the mind to have unclear thoughts about what one is doing. That is the whole of Plato's morality. I hope I've given some substance to the claim that we can't refer to radical evil as though we were referring to an observable fact or an existing state of affairs. We can do so only part as a specific kind of inquiry into the reality of our situation that reconfigures it from our ordinary ways of making sense and explaining. It may become part of the way we see things, the way we read the world in base terms. The concept of radical evil allows and compels us to read our situation differently, and our reading of this situation confirms the reality of that evil. Of course, this is circular, but not viciously so. It might be a circle going around which we grow by looking, as Iris Murdoch says somewhere. The hope I found in Schell connected me to my childhood passion for stories like The Lord of the Rings, and even with my baptismal vows, a way to see evil as real and present in a way that demands my resistance, whatever that means. I don't presume to know what kind of political action might combat the radical evil of our nuclear situation, and by extension of our environmental situation generally. But I am persuaded that we must strive to make the unthinkable thinkable in some way, that resistance begins with understanding, and understanding that comprehends the science within a historical and humanistic framework. The extinction of the human race would be bad, and we should try to prevent it. The destruction of humanity by our own actions would be evil, and we must try to resist it, if only by making it possible to think, by making it thinkable. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. I'm going to spotlight myself along with you and put to you some of the excellent questions that we've gotten as the lecture has gone on. I have 5 of them, which I'm going to put to you not in the order in which I've gotten them, but I'm going to organize them thematically from more general to more specific. So the first one is from Edward Tomlinson. The question is radical evil a uniquely modern problem, meaning that we today, more so in the past than in the past, have an ability to commit crimes on a massive magnitude, or has it been a part of the human psyche that has never been realized in past times?
Thank you. That's the question, isn't it? I would say that both Schell and Arendt are saying it is a modern, even 20th century phenomenon, that it is not evil that is generated by human individual will, but evil that is somehow systemic and systematic, and that follows a logic that is not a human logic and is not related to any kinds of human self-interest, good or bad. So it has to do with, yes, the technology that is available to us, with the kinds of social and economic forces that push us in directions, technological directions that perhaps no individual would choose to go in, but which seem necessary to the situation. Please come back if that doesn't make sense, but it's a great question, and yeah, exactly what I'm trying to say.
On that note of coming back, we probably will have a minute or two for more questions than I've already collected. So if you'd like to follow up, either Edward or anyone else, or write further questions for Amy in the chat, please do so, and I will try to collect them and put them to Amy in good time. For the next question, I'm going to combine 2 related questions, and you can please ask me to restate these if you like, or put them to you one at a time, or take them one at a time, but they are thematically related, so I'm going to group them. One is from Edward. Edward's question is, how should we respond to this threat as it becomes increasingly clear that it can be a possibility to destroy the world many times over? And then Patricia Brichta asked a related question: if evil is radical and beyond will, can it be defeated or even rejected?
I wish. I think I don't know. What we can do. And part of the reason it's so hard for me to think evil is that I like to think about things I can do something about. And to find a situation where you don't know what you can do about it, I think leads people, us, me, all of us, to want to leap to some thing that we can do to make ourselves feel better about a situation that is completely overwhelming. For myself, the clarity and the even excitement that I felt had to do with feeling like now I have a task, which is to try to understand this thing that I can't understand. So the whole, I don't know, maybe some of you know that Elder and I are devoting next year and the following year to something that we're calling the ends of humanity, which is an attempt to think our situation at this stage of the human career, reading classic texts and trying to bring the way that the humanities can reconfigure our thinking and our feeling and our loving and willing in ways that we can try to meet this evil by thinking it clearly. Again, if that doesn't respond to what you were trying to ask, please ask again. But that's another perfect question.
Yeah, I'm going to amplify just Patricia's question by itself to see if you have any thoughts about this in particular. If evil is radical and beyond will, can it be defeated or even rejected?
It can be rejected. I mean, I think I renounce it, but I don't think. I suppose it could be defeated, but I don't know how.
Well, nice to have a real life demo of how to reject it in any case. Thank you. Steve, the next question comes from Steve Peters. This relates directly to something you brought up in the lecture that you read about in Schell's book. The idea of mutually assured destruction is to some the primary deterrence to the use of nuclear weapons. This all depends on the existence of game theory. If the existence of nuclear weapons is evil, is the mathematical analysis of nuclear war evil too? Does that transfer to the frameworks that evolved to support this analysis, namely the claim that they are evil?
Yeah, thank you. Just the fact, I mean, one of the things that Schell brings out really well is how we have this great information about how much destruction is done by a 10 kiloton bomb, which is what was dropped on Hiroshima. And all you got to do is multiply it by however much more powerful the next bomb is, up to 1,600 times more powerful for certain hydrogen bombs. And then you can know like at what distance people will be vaporized, at what distance they'll be incinerated, at what distance they'll receive third degree, second degree, first degree burns. I mean, there's and Schell just points out that there's something just obscene about the very kind of calculations that go into this. I mean, it's not. I want to say it's not the nuclear bombs that are evil. It's the whole situation that involves the nuclear bombs and the strategizing about using them, which Schell describes the obscenity of what would be revenge genocide. It's like, okay, so you dropped a bomb on us. It just, anyway. So Steve, the answer is yes, all of it. It's an evil situation. It's not. I'm not saying that the individuals who are doing the game theory are evil. They're doing what they need to do in order to make the plans they need to make in order to preserve the bombs we need to preserve in order to keep the global peace we need to keep. And that's precisely what's so horrifying. How are we here? In Blood Meridian, the judge says that war is the highest game, and there's no game that the thing that makes a game great is if it's for life or death. The higher the stakes, the more noble the game. Well, here we have, like, in Judge Holden's view, the most noble game there could be, which is the stakes of the survival of part of humanity or not.
Patricia actually has just asked what I think is a related question. I take it you're saying deliberation in the way of working out tactics and strategy regarding nuclear warfare is horrifying, infected by a kind of evil as just the prospect of nuclear warfare itself. I wonder about the evaluation of evil in an ordinary way that we evaluate at least bad things as more and less. So Patricia has asked about this in particular. So Patricia says, death camps seem like a different kind of degree of evil than nuclear extinction, more human, less technological, or is that a specious distinction?
Another very, very good question. I mean, I think ultimately I want to say both death camps and nuclear destruction are radically evil, which means all the way down, absolutely evil, infinitely evil. And I'm not one of those mathematicians for which there are bigger or smaller infinities. Yes, they're different. Yes, the death camps had more human intention to them. But in Arendt's view, the totalitarian movement itself takes on its own energy. And the death camps, the concentration camps, are the fundamental institution of the totalitarian movement. And one of the things that she says is that it's a movement. Nothing can ever be fixed. If anything became fixed, there would become standards again. And if there were standards, there would become some kind of morality and some kind of institution, and human beings would be able to talk to one another and make some kind of arrangement. But in the movement, it just steamrolls human beings and their plans. It has to do what it needs to do in order to continue to move as it's moving. And so it in a way creates a set of imperatives for the camps, which then work back upon the movement as a whole, which is to say, yes, it is humanly done, and there are human criminals who are involved in a way that is perhaps different from the nuclear situation, but they're both outside of the control of the people who are running them, I think, if that makes sense.
Thank you, Amy. There is a comment that I'm going to turn into a question that seems relevant to maybe both of these last thoughts, but especially the previous thought you were offering about game theory and its relationship to nuclear war. So B. Jacques asks or says, it seems like some of what you're saying ties back to your grammar concept. The words describing weapons and so forth lose meaning or don't have meaning because they are sterile words, euphemisms, and so forth. What do you think?
Great, thank you. Yes, I mean that's sort of, I may not have done, you just did a better job than I did of explaining why we had to start with grammar. That it's the term radical evil being an innovation allows us to name something in a way that reveals something about what it is. And it doesn't, again, it isn't like naming objects in a category or a species in a genus. It's a narrative kind of thing, which allows you to put together the facts in particular ways to give them particular sense. So yeah, thank you. Yes, I guess is my answer to that question.
I'm going to ask you my own question about that. So it seems like one of the many productive uses of this kind of grammatical analysis is to employ it in a situation in which it's either very difficult or impossible to give a definition or say what the meaning of something is in a traditional sense, or it's somehow misguided to attempt to do so. Piggybacking on B's thought, so is the thought something like, or is one of the animating thoughts behind your approach to offering a grammar of radical evil something like, well, traditional attempts at definition are going to leave us flat for various reasons. So grammar is a kind of backup related activity that can accomplish a similar kind of end, help us come to grips with the thing in the absence of the alternative. What do you think?
Yeah, I know, I think so. And I the sort of, to call something evil or radically evil is, as I also try to say, part of a practice, part of a discussion, a conversation, an inquiry that involves also looking at art, or that attempts to reconfigure our situation. The threat of destroying the entire human history, you can't, compare it to anything. You can't relate it to anything. You can't, all of, we treat it like another news item, another item in the federal budget, another, meeting that the president has to have, rather than seeing it, I think, for what it is, which is something that calls into question the entire meaning of our humanity, our whole history, who we are. The difference between, and I spent a lot of time thinking about this, and I don't know if I did a very good job of communicating it. The difference between the extinction of the species, which we can't really think, and the destruction of humanity, which we can't think either, there's still, I think, a difference there. The extinction of the species is something that's going to happen someday, somehow. I don't know how. And the species, that it's a natural, it'll be a natural event. The destruction of our humanity will be a human event. And it requires a different way of thinking than thinking about the extinction of the species, it seems to me. Why does it matter? Not just because, I like being a human being and I'd like my children to grow up, but nothing that anyone's ever done will have meant anything other than that we were busy working out our own destruction. Is just something that I don't think we can live with. I didn't answer your question, though.
All right, it was an interesting answer, and I think it made interesting contact with the question in any case. Here's a question from Fred Bolter. It says, I'm going to try to get the voice of this right. Seems generative AI has the capacity to be evil. Was Oppenheimer incorrect in quoting the Bhagavad Gita when he saw the successful detonation, when he said, "Now I am become death, destroyer of worlds"?
That's two different things, right?
Like,
Yeah, I don't even know how to think about AI. Yeah, probably. No, I think Oppenheimer was just right when he said that. I mean, it's not his fault. He was just doing what needed to be done. I mean, one of the things that Schell says is that, you know, the production of the atomic bomb was obviously also a result of the Nazi power. And with the end of the war, we, the United States, inherited the legacy of genocide by having the bomb. I mean, the Nazis started it, or maybe they didn't start it, but they perfected it and then handed it off to us with the atomic achievement.
Thanks, Amy. All right, we have one more question, and it is just a request to comment on a rather long quotation, which I will try to read. This is from Stanislav Lem in something called Provocation.
Can you put it on the screen?
Give me a second. I think I can. So this is the full quotation, along with, I believe, a preface from George Baer. That's in the chat, so you can read along. So it's evil. I inserted an extra V as I was trying to paste that. The measurement problem, radical versus banal, and so forth. An opinion from a thinker who actually had experienced evil during the Shoah. And here is the quotation, I believe. Evil is more diverse than good. There are ideologues who are abstractionists of bloodshed, who themselves would not hurt a fly. But there are also practical naturalists who kill con amore, with pleasure, although they lack the gift of justifying the crime. Nazism united both in its state, since it needed them equally. It at the same time rested on two pillars, the ethics of evil and the aesthetics of kitsch, bad taste. The ethics of evil, as already mentioned, does not engage in self-glorification. Evil is always portrayed in it as an instrument of some good. Any thoughts?
That's, yeah, I want to think about it. Arendt talks about how the first guards of the concentration camps were deranged criminals who sadists. But when they were taken over by the SS, they were run by more normal people whose humanity had to be deconstructed, just as the humanity of the inmates was, in order for them to be able to do what they did. So I don't know, that might speak to the people who are abstractionists of bloodshed, versus they needed both the people who killed with pleasure and then the ones who learned to kill. And the idea, the relation of kitsch and bad taste and banality to evil is another, I think, really interesting and useful thing to think about, that Arendt suggests that thinking itself might inoculate people against doing evil, that Eichmann spoke virtually only in cliches, that having these ready-made formula available for describing what was done allowed him to do it. Every time I'm tempted to use a cliche, I think of Eichmann, and I think of the discipline of thinking as being being possibly a way of resisting evil. There's a lot more in that quote than that, and thank you for it.
Great callback to Plato's Great Beast. Okay, well, it is 1:30 on the dot. Well done, Amy. We will, it's difficult to respond to radical evil or know-how, but we can respond to Amy's lecture with some appreciation and gratitude. I'm going to ask you all in basic program tradition to unmute and thank Amy in the way that you would if we were all together in an auditorium. So please join me in thanking Amy with your hands and your voices. Here we go.
Thank you, Amy.
Thank you. That was
Lots to
great.
think about.
Thank
you. That was
Wonderful.
Great job. Well done. Bravo.
Thank you, Amy. Thanks everyone for coming. We'll see you all again sometime soon. Have a great summer.
Thank you.
Bye.
I'm sorry.